Frugal cooking tricks only poor families knew, but we forgot once kept food on the table when money was gone. These simple tricks stretched scraps into meals that carried dignity and survival. How did such hard-earned wisdom fade from our kitchens? Potato pancakes were one of the most common ways poor families made use of leftovers because nothing could be wasted in a household that was barely scraping by. When a pot of mashed potatoes went cold and stiff the next morning, it did not go into the trash, but instead into a frying pan. Mothers would form little patties out of the mash, dust them with a light coat of flour, and fry them in a skillet until the edges were golden and crisp. The result was something hearty enough to feel like a fresh breakfast or even a side dish at supper. Kids thought of them as a treat because the sizzling sound in the pan promised something different from the plain boiled potatoes they often saw on the table. Potato pancakes were flexible too, and could be eaten plain with a sprinkle of salt or dressed up with a dollop of gravy if the family had any to spare. They were filling without requiring new ingredients, which was always the goal. This trick of repurposing cold mashed potatoes meant the family stretched a single meal into two, and in times when every penny counted, that was survival. Cabbage stretchers in stews were another clever trick because one head of cabbage could turn a thin pot of soup into something that looked and felt like a feast. Meat was often the most expensive part of a dish, and for poor families, it was rationed out in the smallest amounts. By chopping cabbage into hearty chunks and tossing it into the pot, the stew suddenly had volume, fiber, and bulk that gave the impression of generosity even when there was very little meat inside. The cabbage would soak up the broth and carry the flavor of the bones or scraps that had been simmering for hours. Families leaned on this method heavily in the Depression era and during wartime because it meant no one walked away hungry, even if the protein was scarce. The sweet and soft cabbage mingled with potatoes, onions, or carrots to create something simple but deeply comforting. It might not have been glamorous, but it kept bellies warm through long winters. Stretching meat this way was the difference between a family meal and a disappointing half-empty pot. Cornmeal mush was one of those dishes that seemed too plain to matter, yet it carried families through some of the hardest years of the 20th century. Cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and available almost everywhere, making it a perfect staple for kitchens that had to make a little go a long way. Mothers would stir cornmeal into boiling water until it thickened into a soft porridge that could be served plain, sweetened with molasses, or salted and fried the next morning. Fried slices of cornmeal mush were especially popular because they crisped beautifully and tasted rich without costing much. Families ate it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was in the pantry. Sometimes gravy was poured on top to make it feel like a proper supper, especially when meat was absent. The dish did not need much imagination to prepare, but it carried the weight of survival by being endlessly adaptable and nourishing. It was proof that even the simplest grain could keep a family fed when there was no money for flour or bread. Dandelion green salad was the definition of making something out of nothing, because this food was plucked straight from yards, fields, and roadsides. Poor families knew that nature itself could provide when store shelves or wallets could not. Children were often sent outside with small baskets to gather bunches of the bitter greens, which were then washed carefully and dressed with a splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of salt. It was not glamorous, but it was fresh, and it came without a price tag. Many families swore by the health benefits of these wild greens because they offered vitamins that were otherwise hard to come by when diets were thin on fresh produce. The taste was sharp and earthy, but hunger made everything more welcome, and the salad filled a gap that could not be ignored. Eating what the land gave you, even if it was a weed, was a skill that kept countless households going during hard times. The drippings jar was a permanent fixture in poor families' kitchens, often sitting right by the stove. Anytime bacon, pork, or beef was cooked, the leftover fat was carefully poured into the jar rather than thrown away. That fat became liquid gold, used to fry potatoes, season vegetables, or spread on bread like butter. It brought depth of flavor to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain or thin. Families guarded their drippings jars fiercely because a spoonful of fat could transform scraps into something satisfying. It was also a way of honoring the idea that nothing from the animal should go to waste, not even the grease. In homes where butter was rare and expensive, drippings filled the role of fat in cooking and baking. Many children grew up associating the taste of bacon grease with comfort because it flavored so much of what they ate. For poor families, the drippings jar was less a choice and more a necessity that stretched their meals further than money alone could. Bread pudding was born out of thrift and necessity, and it was one of the sweetest tricks poor families held on to during the lean years. When loaves of bread grew stale and too hard for sandwiches, mothers refused to toss them out. Instead, they soaked the cubes in milk, added a little sugar or molasses, and baked them until the dish puffed up golden brown. If eggs were available, they went in too, but the recipe worked with whatever could be spared. Raisins, cinnamon, or even scraps of leftover jam sometimes found their way into the mix to give it more character. The result was a dessert that felt indulgent without costing anything extra. For children, it was often the only sweet treat they saw in a week, and for parents, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn waste into joy. Bread pudding tasted like comfort, and more than that, it tasted like resilience. Egg drop soup with watered stock was an old-world trick that became common in poor American households too. The base of the soup was usually just bones or thin broth that had already been stretched as far as possible. To make it feel substantial, a beaten egg was whisked in while the pot simmered, turning into ribbons of soft protein that thickened the liquid. It was cheap, fast, and filling, 3 words that defined survival cooking. Sometimes chopped scallions or leftover greens would be added, but the egg itself was the key to making it taste like a real dish instead of just flavored water. Poor families leaned on this recipe because it delivered nourishment without demanding many ingredients. It was a small act of ingenuity that made hunger easier to bear. Stuffed cabbage rolls were a trick passed down through immigrant families that quickly became a staple for poor households across America. The idea was simple but brilliant. Use cabbage leaves as wrappers and fill them with rice, scraps of meat, onions, or whatever was on hand. Rolled up and simmered in tomato sauce, the bundles became hearty meals that filled plates without using much meat. The rice stretched the protein further, and the cabbage provided bulk, which meant one small pot could feed an entire family. Leftovers kept well and could be reheated for another day, which was always a bonus. Stuffed cabbage rolls were beloved because they looked and felt like real dinners, even when money was scarce. They reminded families that creativity in the kitchen could bring dignity to the table. Corn fritters were another staple of survival kitchens, born out of the love for cornmeal and the convenience of canned corn. Families mixed flour, baking powder, and a few spoonfuls of corn into a batter and fried it in oil or drippings until golden and crisp. The result was a cheap side dish that paired with soups, stews, or even just a glass of milk. Corn fritters filled stomachs while offering a little crunch and sweetness, which made them feel special compared to plain bread. Kids loved them because they resembled little pancakes, and parents appreciated that they required almost no ingredients. For families living on very little, corn fritters were proof that something humble could still taste delightful. Onion sandwiches sound harsh to modern ears, but during the Depression, they were an honest reflection of survival. When meat, cheese, or spreads were unavailable, families made do with what they had. Sliced raw onions were placed between buttered bread and eaten as lunch or supper. The strong bite of the onion, combined with the richness of the butter, gave just enough satisfaction to feel like a real meal. These sandwiches were not glamorous, but they were quick, cheap, and required almost nothing. They became a symbol of making the best out of bleak circumstances. For many who grew up in those years, the memory of onion sandwiches lingers as both a hardship and a badge of resilience. Apple brown. Betty was a dessert that showed just how creative poor families could be when faced with stale bread that would otherwise be tossed aside. The dish began with layers of buttered crumbs made from the old bread, placed into a baking dish alongside sliced apples and a sprinkle of sugar. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg was added if the spice jar still had a little left, and molasses or honey could step in when sugar was short. Once baked, the mixture turned into something warm, sweet, and comforting that felt almost luxurious compared to the daily meals of beans and bread. Kids especially loved it because it tasted like pie but was far easier and cheaper to make. Parents loved it because it stretched ingredients they already had in the pantry. The smell of apples and sugar baking in the oven made even the smallest kitchen feel rich for a little while. Apple Brown Betty was not just about feeding a family on scraps, it was about giving them a taste of joy when times were otherwise lean. For many, the memory of this simple dessert is tied to childhood and survival, proof that comfort can be baked out of almost nothing. Mock apple pie, also called Ritz cracker pie, was one of the most inventive tricks to come out of the Depression years when real apples were far too expensive for struggling families. Instead of fruit, crushed crackers were layered with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of lemon juice to mimic the flavor and texture of apples. Once baked inside a pie crust, it fooled more than a few people into thinking it was the real thing. The trick was in how the crackers softened during baking, blending with the sugar and spice until they resembled stewed apples. Families cherished this recipe because it allowed them to serve what looked like a proper dessert without needing costly fruit. Children especially delighted in telling guests they were eating apple pie, only to reveal the secret later. It was part fun, part necessity, but it gave families pride in serving something clever that still tasted good. The mock apple pie proved that frugality could be playful as well as practical. And while it faded with time, the memory of turning simple crackers into a pie that looked and tasted like the real thing remains an enduring story of resourceful cooking. A boiled dinner was one of the heartiest frugal meals poor families relied on, born from the idea that you could simmer almost anything together and create a dish filling enough to last for days. The base usually included bits of inexpensive meat or even bones that were boiled slowly with potatoes, cabbage, and turnips. The long cooking time softened the vegetables and drew every bit of flavor out of the meat scraps, creating a broth that felt rich even if little protein was used. Nothing was wasted, and leftovers were often saved and reheated for the next day, with new vegetables added to stretch it further. This kind of dish was common in rural households and immigrant communities where thrift was already a way of life. It brought warmth in the winter and offered the satisfaction of a stew without the cost of a heavy roast or expensive cuts. Families valued boiled dinners not only for nourishment, but also because they fed large households with minimal effort. It was the kind of meal that could be adjusted endlessly depending on what was available, and it gave poor families the assurance that no one would leave the table hungry, no matter how little was in the pantry. Split pea soup with ham bone was one of the cleverest ways poor families managed to squeeze the last bit of value out of what little meat they could afford. Instead of throwing away the bone after a ham dinner, it would be saved, simmered for hours with dried split peas, onions, and carrots until the marrow and scraps of meat flavored the pot. Dried peas were cheap, filling, and available in bulk, making them an essential pantry staple. The soup was thick and hearty, providing protein and warmth when fresh meat was a luxury out of reach. For children, it might not have been glamorous, but for parents, it was a reliable way to stretch one bone into meals for several days. Leftovers often thickened overnight, turning into something that could be spread on bread or reheated into an even heartier dish. The humble split pea soup became a reminder that frugality could create comfort, and that resourcefulness often turned scraps into something beloved. Many who grew up on it carried the taste into adulthood, not as a reminder of poverty, but of the creativity that helped families survive lean times with dignity and full bellies. Mock fish fillets were a prime example of how poor families learned to satisfy cravings for foods they could not afford. Fresh fish was often too expensive or simply unavailable, so mothers recreated it by using mashed beans, potatoes, or even softened bread shaped into patties and fried until golden brown. With the right seasoning and texture, the finished product resembled a fish fillet closely enough to fool the taste buds. The flavor came from onions, parsley, and pepper, if the family could spare them, and the frying process gave the patties a satisfying crunch. These imitations were not made to trick anyone into thinking they had fish, but to bring variety and novelty to dinner tables that would otherwise grow monotonous. Children enjoyed the playful presentation, while parents knew it was an affordable way to serve something that felt special. The recipe was passed around in community cookbooks, each household tweaking it with what they had on hand. It was not glamorous, but it made people smile and fed them well, which was what mattered most. Mock fish fillets showed that even when real seafood was out of reach, ingenuity could bring a sense of abundance back into the home kitchen. Wilted lettuce salad was a dish born from scraps and thrift, yet it carried a surprising richness thanks to one key ingredient: bacon grease. When lettuce leaves and onions began to wilt and lose their crispness, they would normally be destined for the compost heap, but frugal families found a way to revive them. Hot bacon drippings poured directly over the greens softened them further, creating a warm, hearty salad that carried the smoky flavor of meat even when little or none was present in the meal. It was quick, practical, and delicious, especially when paired with a slice of bread or some leftover potatoes. This trick turned otherwise wasted vegetables into a centerpiece that felt indulgent in its own way. Families loved it because it brought together two important frugal lessons: never waste food and always reuse fat. Wilted lettuce salad became a way to turn decline into comfort, reminding everyone at the table that nothing in the kitchen had to go unused. It was proof that poor families not only survived on scraps, but could transform them into dishes that still carried flavor, warmth, and satisfaction, even when the cupboards were almost bare. Cornbread and milk supper was a meal so humble it seems almost too simple to count, yet it filled countless bellies when money was scarce. The dish was nothing more than leftover cornbread crumbled into a bowl and covered with cold milk, sometimes sweetened slightly if sugar or molasses could be spared. It was eaten with a spoon, straight out of the bowl, and was considered a full supper by many families who had little else. For children, it often felt like a treat because it resembled cereal before boxed cereal was common, while for adults it was a reliable way to fill up at the end of the day. The beauty of the dish was its practicality. Cornbread was cheap to make, milk was nourishing, and together they created something greater than the sum of their parts. It was quick, easy, and required no additional cooking, which made it ideal for families tired after long days of work. Cornbread and milk supper reminded people that sometimes the simplest foods carried the greatest comfort, especially when hunger pressed close. It may have been born of hardship, but it became one of the most remembered frugal meals of its era. Pot liquor with cornbread was not just a dish, it was a philosophy of frugality passed down in Southern kitchens. Pot liquor was the leftover cooking liquid from boiling greens such as collards, turnips, or mustard, rich with vitamins and nutrients that seeped into the water. Rather than pour it out, poor families saved it and sopped it up with chunks of cornbread, creating a meal that cost almost nothing yet was surprisingly nourishing. It was especially valued during times when meat and dairy were scarce, as it provided iron and other nutrients that kept families strong. Many considered it a delicacy despite its humble origins, and the flavor of smoky greens mixed with soft cornbread became a treasured memory. Pot liquor embodied the idea that nothing should go to waste, and even the water from cooking vegetables could become a meal in its own right. It fed generations through poverty and war, and its legacy still lingers in Southern cooking today. What some might see as scraps, poor families saw as opportunity, and pot liquor with cornbread was one of the most ingenious and life-sustaining dishes ever created out of near nothing. Fried bologna slices were known as a poor man's steak because they gave families a taste of meat without the cost of beef. Bologna was one of the cheapest processed meats available, and when sliced and fried in a skillet, it developed a crispy edge and savory aroma that made it feel far more indulgent than it really was. The sizzling sound and curling edges of the slices became familiar in many households where fresh cuts of meat were too expensive to afford. Served on bread with mustard or alongside potatoes, fried bologna made its way into countless meals that might otherwise have felt incomplete. Children often thought of it as a treat because it tasted so different from the usual beans or stews. Parents appreciated it for its affordability and the way it stretched across several sandwiches or suppers. Fried bologna slices represented thrift, ingenuity, and the desire to make even processed meat feel special. They were simple, practical, and deeply nostalgic for anyone who grew up on them. It was proof that a skillet and a few thin slices could turn something cheap into something memorable at the dinner table. Rice and raisins porridge was a dish that offered both sweetness and sustenance in households that could afford very little. Rice was one of the cheapest staples that could stretch across many meals, and cooking it in milk instead of water turned it into something creamy and filling. Adding raisins provided a burst of sweetness and a bit of chew, transforming plain rice into a dish that felt like dessert, yet doubled as breakfast or supper. Children loved the hint of fruit, and parents relied on it because it filled bowls without demanding expensive ingredients. Sugar or cinnamon might be added if available, but even plain, it was comforting and nourishing. It was especially popular during the Depression and wartime years when both money and variety were scarce. Rice and raisins porridge carried warmth and familiarity, and many who ate it as children recall it as one of the few sweet dishes they knew. It represented the cleverness of poor families who found ways to make humble staples into something beloved. A simple pot of rice, milk, and raisins could feel like kindness in a time when luxuries were few and far between. Soup bone broth was one of the most valuable tricks that poor families held on to because it created nourishment out of what others would throw away. Butchers often gave away or sold bones at a very low price, and those bones still held flavor, fat, and marrow that could be coaxed out with time. Families simmered them for hours with water, onions, or carrots if they had them, and what resulted was a rich stock that could be sipped as soup or used as the base for stews and gravies. This broth was especially important in the winter because it gave warmth and substance without requiring much meat at all. Sometimes scraps of vegetables or herbs were tossed in, making the meal even more filling, but the bones themselves carried most of the value. For poor families, nothing was wasted, and even what seemed like trash to others could become the backbone of survival. A pot of soup bone broth on the stove was a sign that a family would eat, even when money was nearly gone. Oatmeal griddle cakes were a clever solution to the problem of leftover porridge that hardened in the pot overnight. Instead of scraping it out and throwing it away, families shaped the cold oats into patties, dusted them with flour, and fried them on a griddle until crisp on the outside and soft inside. The cakes could be eaten plain, with a bit of butter if available, or even drizzled with syrup or molasses when a sweet touch was possible. They were hearty enough for breakfast, but also served as a side at supper when little else was left to put on the table. This dish showed the creativity of households that made food stretch further by giving it a second life. Kids often liked the crunch and thought it was something new, while parents saw it as practicality. It was proof that nothing, not even a pot of old oatmeal, had to go to waste. Oatmeal griddle cakes carried families through many mornings when resources were scarce. Shoefly pie was a dessert that came straight out of necessity during times when sugar was scarce and expensive. Instead of relying on refined sugar, families turned to molasses, which was cheap, available, and still sweet enough to satisfy. The pie was made with a crumbly topping, a rich molasses filling, and a simple crust that could be mixed together with pantry staples. Its deep flavor made it stand out from more common desserts, and it carried a comforting richness that was missing from most tables. Poor households cherished it because it felt like a luxury, even though it was born from frugality. It became popular in rural communities and was passed down through generations as a reminder of making do with what you had. While today molasses is less common in everyday baking, back then it was the savior of desserts, keeping families from feeling deprived of sweetness. Shoefly pie was proof that even lean years could still make room for a treat that lifted spirits and fed the soul. Baked beans with salt pork was one of the most filling and affordable meals families relied on when meat was in short supply. Beans were cheap, easy to store, and packed with protein, making them a dependable staple in poor households. Adding a small cube of salt pork gave the dish a smoky flavor that made it feel like a complete dinner. Families would put the pot on early in the day, letting the beans cook slowly until tender while the pork released its flavor. The result was a dish that fed large families and could be stretched across multiple meals. Often leftovers were reheated and eaten with bread, making it last even longer. It was a recipe that proved how a tiny bit of meat could transform an otherwise plain pot of beans into something hearty and satisfying. For many people, baked beans with salt pork became more than just dinner. It became a tradition that represented the ingenuity and survival spirit of struggling households. Molasses milk was a simple drink that highlighted the resourcefulness of poor families who had to stretch sweeteners during tough years. Refined sugar was expensive, but molasses was cheap, plentiful, and packed with energy. Families would stir a spoonful into a glass of milk, creating a sweet, filling drink that could serve as a quick breakfast or a treat for children. It gave milk a dark, caramel-like flavor and made it feel more indulgent than it really was. For kids who rarely had candy or desserts, molasses milk was often the closest thing to a treat. Parents appreciated that it was affordable and nourishing, giving children calories and strength for the day ahead. This small trick turned ordinary milk into something memorable, and for many it remained a nostalgic flavor long after times had improved. Molasses milk proved that survival cooking did not always mean hardship. Sometimes it meant finding joy in the simplest, cheapest combinations. It was a drink born of thrift, but remembered for comfort. Fried potato skins were a shining example of the rule that nothing could be wasted in a poor household. When potatoes were peeled for soups or stews, the skins were not discarded but saved, washed, and fried in fat until they turned crisp. Sprinkled with salt, they became a cheap side dish or snack that added a bit of variety to meals that were otherwise repetitive. Children often loved them because they were crunchy and fun to eat, like a homemade chip. Parents valued them because they made use of every part of the potato, turning scraps into food. In communities where bartering was common, fried skins were even traded for other small goods, proving their worth beyond the dinner table. This dish taught families the value of thrift in the kitchen, where waste was not an option. Fried potato skins might have been born of necessity, but they ended up being one of the most beloved frugal tricks that turned scraps into satisfaction. Cabbage soup was the very definition of survival cooking, built on the idea that you could feed a family with little more than vegetables and water. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and filling, and when paired with potatoes, carrots, or onions, it created a soup that kept stomachs full. Families often boiled it for hours, sometimes with a bone or bit of fat to add depth, but even without meat, it was nourishing enough to serve as a meal. For poor households, it was one of the most dependable recipes because it cost so little yet went so far. During winters, it became a staple, warming people from the inside out while stretching a few cents worth of ingredients into multiple bowls. Children may not have loved its plainness, but they grew up remembering it as the dish that got them through hungry days. Cabbage soup represented endurance, showing how something humble could sustain life in times of scarcity. It was not glamorous, but it was a steady comfort for generations who had little else. Cold potato salad with vinegar was a way to give new life to leftover boiled potatoes, turning them into something fresh instead of letting them go to waste. Families would slice or cube the potatoes, splash them with vinegar, and add onions or herbs if they had them. The sharpness of the vinegar balanced the starchiness of the potato, creating a side dish that felt different from the usual fare. It was cheap, quick, and did not require any new ingredients, which made it popular during the Depression and wartime years. Served cold, it was especially welcome in the summer when cooking fuel was too costly to waste on heating heavy meals. Poor households loved it because it was flexible and could be scaled up or down depending on how many potatoes were left over. It was proof that with a little creativity, even yesterday's scraps could become today's meal. Cold potato salad with vinegar showed how poor families made every bite count, turning the ordinary into something practical and memorable. Gingerbread with sorghum was one of the clever substitutes for desserts when refined sugar was out of reach. Sorghum syrup was cheaper, widely available in farming regions, and had a deep flavor that made gingerbread rich and satisfying. Families mixed it with flour, spices, and eggs when they had them, baking it into a cake that filled the house with warmth. It became a favorite treat during the holidays, but it also showed up on ordinary days when people wanted a taste of sweetness. Sorghum added a complexity that sugar lacked, giving the bread a hearty quality that poor households came to cherish. For children, it felt like a real dessert, and for parents, it was an affordable way to mark special occasions. The smell of sorghum gingerbread baking in the oven carried hope in times when luxuries were rare. Even though it was born of necessity, it became beloved for its flavor and the memories attached. Gingerbread with sorghum proved that thrift could still create moments of joy and celebration. Homemade noodles in broth were a frugal trick that stretched a little flour and water into something that felt substantial. Families rolled out dough made from flour, eggs if available, and a bit of salt, then cut it into thin strips. These noodles were dropped into a pot of broth, often made from bones or scraps, turning a thin soup into a filling dinner. The noodles soaked up the flavor and gave the impression of a rich meal, even when meat was scarce. Poor households relied on this dish because it was versatile, affordable, and could feed large families with very little effort. It brought comfort during winters and reminded families of old traditions passed down from immigrant kitchens. Every bowl was a reminder that survival often meant making something from almost nothing. Homemade noodles in broth stood as a symbol of resilience, showing how creativity in the kitchen turned flour and scraps into warmth and nourishment that carried families through the hardest of times. Saving cereal crumbs might sound like a breakfast problem, but in the 70s it was a dinner solution. The bottom of every box, those tiny broken flakes or puffed bits, were too good to waste. Instead of tossing them out, home cooks swept them into a bowl, crushed them finer with a rolling pin, and used them to coat chicken or pork chops. Cornflakes were the most popular. They gave a golden, crispy crust that clung to meat and stayed crunchy in the oven. Sometimes they were mixed with salt or paprika. Sometimes they were just dumped from the bag onto the plate. Either way, they worked. It was a fast way to fake fried chicken without needing oil or breadcrumbs. The coating crisped up in the oven and fooled most people. It proved dinner did not have to be expensive to taste great. And it taught kids something useful. Nothing should be wasted, not even cereal dust. It might not have looked fancy, but it made for one satisfying crunch. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Jello molds were a typical 20th century snack that let people get creative and fashionable with their desserts. You could use them for gelatin-based dishes or jelly bowls and cakes, and they were very common at parties and family gatherings. Of course, the kids in particular enjoyed Jello molds the most out of everyone else, even if they had no idea how to use them to shape the Jello properly. That is probably why every grandma always had some of these, though, so that when their grandkids eventually did come over, they could enjoy playing around with their food a little before. After all, they would probably get scolded for doing so at home. To be honest, most Jello mold brands got really popular in the 1960s in particular as they became a convenient trend since Jello was also getting more and more popular. Cloth bags can actually help your cheese age just right, and I bet that sounds like a really weird mix to you, but it's as legitimate as a mix can be. The right conditions for aging all happen inside the wonderful confines of a cloth bag, so you have that for one. Basically, to age cheese and to age it properly, you need three different things. You need moisture that's regulated, and you need a lot of air circulation. None of that means anything if your environment isn't clean, so you need to be able to prevent contamination as well as you can. Moisture regulation is really important because as it keeps aging, then cheese starts losing moisture. Cloth bags, on the other hand, are made of really breathable material and help moisture to evaporate a bit more slowly so that the cheese doesn't get too dry. Cheese aging also helps keep air balanced since the cloth bag is really porous. All those tiny little openings help air to flow around the cheese, which you really need for the health of the rind. It helps for those helpful little bacteria and molds that you find on cheese to grow. Some of those microorganisms don't deserve to die in a heat death. They make your burger a lot better. Third of all, the bag itself just works as a natural barrier against any kind of dirty substance, insect, or material. All in all, you get a perfect vibe for your cheese. Now, cheese aging more or less has the same deal. Maturing cheese over time to give each wheel its own unique flavor, personality, and profile is an Italian hobby that probably predates the country's own existence, but in America it was brought on over during the 20th century. The science behind cheese aging basically has a lot to do with breaking down the fat of your regular unchecked milk fats into free fatty acids, which for our purposes, let's just say they have a lot more taste and flavor. Now, the other process is proteolysis, and during the entire cheese aging, enzymes that were taken from the milk and the bacterial cultures used to make the cheese help to break down the proteins that are there. It does the same thing as before, and the longer this goes on, the stronger those flavors become. That's why they really let those things sit for years, because it's basically a game of patience. The one who waits the longest gets the best cheese. If you grew up drinking coffee in the 70s, chances are you saw someone crack an eggshell into the pot. It sounds strange, but it had roots in pioneer cooking. The idea was simple. When you boiled coffee, especially in a percolator, it could get harsh. A crushed eggshell helped mellow the bitterness. The calcium in the shell bound to acid in the grounds, and the result was smoother and more drinkable. You did not taste egg. You just got a brew that went down easier. In homes where instant coffee was frowned upon and electric machines were new, this was how you made it right. It was like adding a pinch of salt, an old tweak passed down in hushed kitchen wisdom. Coffee was serious business, especially after a long day. And if all it took was saving your eggshells and rinsing them off, that was a small price to pay. People liked their coffee strong, but not bitter. This was how they got it just right. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Butter curlers were another little trinket that saw a lot of use in most households, thanks to the simple benefits of life it would let you enjoy, like very pretty-looking butter. Some home chefs were much more focused on presentation, decoration, and maintaining the ambiance with the look of their food than others. They always had butter curlers handy because at formal meals or dinner parties, this elevated the entire mood because of how good it could make your food look. Homes that had hosting and entertaining as a priority always had curlers around, and nowadays some still use them because of the flexibility it gives you. With butter curlers, you could get more controlled and moderate curls of butter out instead of large spreads that really burned through your stock and had you running to the grocers again and again. Rennet preservation, on the other hand, is a whole different animal. Rennet is an enzyme that's traditionally made from ruminant animals like cows, goats, and sheep. It helps to make cheese because it coagulates milk and causes the proteins in it to curdle and separate. This transformation is pretty much the sole reason why fresh milk even becomes cheese, and I'm going to explain to you how all this works. So, when you mix rennet with milk, it has the enzyme rennet in it. This specifically hits the primary protein in milk, which is casein. Imagine if somebody basically made really specific cuts in your limbs, causing the rest of your body to clump together. Maybe not the most descriptive example, but that's pretty much what happens. What you get left with is whey, and that's drained off. The leftover curds are then processed into different types of cheese. See, people didn't do this because they really love cheese, though. They did it because it was the ideal way to use your milk. Milk would spoil incredibly fast, and for people who were either living a very day-to-day life, taking it as it comes, that just wasn't fitting in with their routines or priorities. Pickle juice was never just for pouring down the sink. In 70s kitchens, it became a briny marinade for hard-boiled eggs, a trick passed down on farms and found in old family lunchboxes. You peeled your eggs, packed them into a jar, and poured the leftover pickle brine right over the top. A few days later, those plain eggs were punchy, salty, and full of flavor. They turned pink if you used beet brine, yellow with turmeric, and stayed pale green if they came from dill. But whatever the color, the taste was always bold. They showed up in deviled eggs, egg salads, or just straight out of the jar with a fork. This was zero-waste cooking at its best. You got a snack, a topping, or a protein boost without spending a penny more. Grandmothers taught it. Fathers packed it. Kids grew up thinking it was normal to see a mason jar of glowing eggs in the fridge. And maybe it was. Back then, nothing was wasted. Not even the salty water left behind by pickles. That kind of kitchen wisdom is hard to find now. But it sure tasted good while it lasted. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself, and if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Butter dishes with lids were something that you would find in almost every household. Just like you would walk in most homes today and expect to find a coffee maker or a deep fryer, back then, in the age of our grandparents, butter dishes were very popular ways of storing the spread. You would keep them at room temperature instead of in the fridge, so they were always soft and spreadable, and you would protect them from any dirt. These existed even before the time of accessible and affordable refrigeration, and they were made from glass or ceramic. Usually, they would be pretty fashionable too, with lots of unique designs and ornate detail put into them. Speaking of fridges, how did people preserve things before they came around? Because keeping everything in a prison of ice was not ideal either. Have you ever heard of turning a milk jar into a butter maker? I bet you haven't, because if I'm being totally honest with you, I didn't know either. Yet the process of churning really helps to keep the cream from separating from the fat that you find in the buttermilk. The milk jar, since it's a glass container with an airtight seal, can even help to churn the butter. I'll tell you why. Butter is made when you basically irritate heavy cream and violently shake it until the point that the cream starts to mix together and stick. Then, you take the liquid and separate it, and that is how you get buttermilk. Milk jars end up being the ideal choice for this because they can hold cream really well and also handle the amount of violent churning and shaking you need to really create the butter. The churning is what causes the cream to start turning into butter, and the tight seal really helps you keep the moisture you need to retain the texture. Freezing in snow is self-explanatory, but there's actually a bit more that goes on there besides what meets the eye and what common sense would tell you up front. People relied on freezing in snow, and yes, preserving food in snow especially meats and proteins, thanks to the insulation properties and temperature regulation, was a fantastic idea. Just some good old-fashioned human resourcefulness and ingenuity rising to the occasion. Love to see it, right? While there's not a lot to say about the scientific aspect of all of this, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the cultural aspect. See, this became a community hobby for people that lived in predominantly cold areas, ones with long winters, or people who just lived in rural places and communities away from urban hubs and industrialization. Gathering snow, making snow caves, storing the meat properly, packing it. All of this became a tradition that was spread through families, and it honestly brought people closer together. While I get that just hearing about it in a video might not drive that point home, but if you take a look at how people were living in rural communities before refrigeration, then it's actually sweet. Kids would help out with making pockets in the snow, adults would spend their day cleaning the meat for the community, and it was all just this nice, fair division of responsibility that taught everyone to work, care for food, and gave them some neat skills. Mashed potatoes had a second life in 70s kitchens, and it came in the form of pancakes. Cold leftovers were mixed with a bit of flour, sometimes an egg, maybe some chopped onion or shredded cheese, and fried until golden brown on both sides. They were crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and tasted like a cross between a hash brown and a fritter. You did not need much oil, just a hot skillet and a little thyme. These pancakes showed up at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on what else was in the fridge. Some were served with applesauce or sour cream, others were eaten plain, straight from the pan. They made something ordinary feel a little special, and they kept leftovers from feeling like a chore. That was the genius of it. You took what you had, gave it a quick flip in the pan, and made something people actually looked forward to eating. No waste, no fuss. Just one more way to stretch a meal a little further. And in a decade where budgets were tight and creativity was everything, these potato pancakes earned their place on plates across the country. Sweetening with birch bark was one of the most ingenious and almost completely forgotten cooking secrets passed down through native traditions. Long before refined sugar ever touched American soil, Native American cooks knew that certain birch trees contained a natural, subtle sweetness hidden within their sap and inner bark. By carefully harvesting thin strips and boiling them down, they created a lightly sweet syrup or infusion that could flavor drinks, breads, and even savory dishes without overwhelming them. It was a sweetness that whispered rather than shouted, blending seamlessly with the smoky, rich flavors of open-fire cooking. Even today, a few remote communities and experimental chefs are bringing birch syrup back to the table, rediscovering a depth of flavor that supermarket sugar can never hope to match. But when it came to cooking full meals without pots or pans, there was one natural vessel that changed everything: giant pumpkins, hollowed out and transformed into Earth's own slow cookers. Besides the obvious reason for recycling and reusing things to avoid any unnecessary spending, these tins were also significantly durable and lasted a long time. They were usually always the perfect size as well, and it was as if they were meant to be a permanent home for sewing supplies. Spools of thread, thimbles, needles, and sharp objects all would hold in one box while being very easy to grab when you needed it. Once you were done, you could just put everything back. Chilled bowls are actually fantastic for placing your whipping cream in because the cold temperatures here really help in keeping the fat in the cream stable. Why is the stability of the fat of your whipping cream a subject you may want to be invested in? Well, that's because unlike keeping a stable diet or sleep schedule, the effects this time around are a lot more immediate. Whipping cream is made up of a lot of fat molecules that get suspended in the water. That's what happens when you whip the cream. Those molecules start clumping together and make what you see. At room temperature even, this fat can start to melt, and it means you lose the texture of whipping cream when it's at its best. If you chill the bowl though, you don't get this problem because the fat actually stays firm and helps the foam keep its shape. Pretty interesting, right? I know I like my whipping cream at tip-top performance, and if you do too, maybe you want to keep this one in mind. Drying your meat and fish in the wind has also been a pretty cultural practice of people who live lives dependent on hunting, gathering, and community-based living. Drying in the wind actually works better because the wind accelerates the evaporation process by getting rid of the moisture that your protein, fish, red meat, or chicken releases on its own. You want to keep it like this because the moving air makes the moisture go away as soon as it releases, making sure it stays chronically dehydrated. Fish, especially the ones that were caught in coastal cities and regions, also used to be gutted and split open and then hung out to dry. This would help the brine enhance the flavor and also make the fish overall easier to carry and transport. Besides that, there were lots of issues with this though. It was really only ideal in warm or moist climates. In cold ones, the humidity had to be low and the air had to be pretty crisp. Also, you had to keep moving and turning the fish or meat so that it would dry evenly and that the moisture was even going away. If you didn't do this, you risked spoiling it yourself. I think there are better ways of drying, but this wasn't a trick that would apply to people like you or me anyway. Before refrigerators were truly reliable in every home, people had tricks to keep milk from turning sour, and one of the simplest was a pinch of baking soda. Just a light sprinkle into the bottle helped neutralize acidity and slowed down the spoiling process. It was not a perfect fix, but it bought you an extra day or two, and sometimes that was all you needed. You could pour milk over cereal, stir it into coffee, or use it for baking without worrying about a sour edge. Housewives passed the tip down like folklore. Some swore by it, others used it only in a pinch, but everyone knew about it. You kept baking soda near the sink, near the fridge, and often near the milk. It worked in a quiet way. No fanfare, no flavor change, just one less thing to throw out. And when milk was expensive or hard to get, saving even half a bottle mattered. The 70s may have had better refrigeration than decades before, but old habits died hard, especially the ones that still worked. And this tiny kitchen science experiment kept a lot of breakfasts, recipes, and cups of coffee from going to waste. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Something that was really common as a bit of decoration in households back then was a teapot. In a sense, it has lost the same love it had in its golden days where people only used teapots for storing their freshly brewed tea, since microwaves are so incredibly common now. They were common in rural areas as well, which is likely where teapots became part of the cottagecore aesthetic. They were also used to brew tea, as you could steep tea leaves in them and let the hot water really soak in all of the flavors and aroma. Teapots came in different shapes and sizes, and you could always experiment and see which one worked the best for you. So wax paper really helps keep ice cream soft because it helps stop those nasty little ice crystals from forming thanks to cutting off its exposure to air. Ice cream tends to get icy or hard over the course of its short life thanks to the large ice crystals that take shape over the surface. This makes it feel really grainy, and it almost means you need to bite the ice cream instead of licking it, and that's just not nice for anyone involved. Wax paper stops this problem right in its tracks by cutting off any exposure to the air, which means that the crystals don't really ever get the chance to form in the first place. This way, ice cream also doesn't lose any moisture as the wax paper helps to retain it. If you don't ever store your ice cream properly, that is, without any airtight sealing, it goes through something known as freezer burn. That happens when the surface of your ice cream gets dehydrated and gets exposed to just a bit too much air. Think of it like getting a cold, if your ice cream could even get that. Just a bit of wax paper takes care of all this, and for almost no effort too. So I know for a fact you've never heard about this one before. Animal bladders being used to vacuum pack is definitely the most ancient preservation method I have on this entire list, and this is all thanks to the natural God-gifted sealing ability of the bladder. Basically, the bladder from large animals like pigs, deer, and cows was the one people used the most because of how flexible and elastic it would be. The bladder would be taken out, cleaned, and then opened. You would then tie or stitch it after the food was packed inside, and the key to preserving this was to remove the air from inside the bladder because, again, you don't want those nasty bacteria getting any air they don't deserve. The bladder would even be inflated by people so that people could get a bit more space for the food. Plus, the vacuum effect created thanks to the bladder being removed meant that it was the ideal environment for not spoiling the food. If we talk about history, then people like early explorers and fur traders would rely on bladders for trade and would pass them to nomadic tribes and communities traveling through the areas. It was also very popular in Arctic regions. There are many risks though, and it requires a lot of skill, because if you don't clean it properly, you just risk contamination badly. Boiling cake batter on the stove might sound strange today, but it was a common step in many old recipes. It was especially popular in homes where oven space was limited or kitchens got too hot in summer. The process started with heating butter, water, sugar, and cocoa, or sometimes spice, in a saucepan. Once it bubbled, you took it off the heat and stirred in flour, eggs, and baking soda. The result? A smooth, shiny batter that baked into cakes with a dense, moist crumb and a texture somewhere between fudge and sponge. These were not airy birthday cakes. These were rich, reliable tray bakes made to be sliced into squares and wrapped in wax paper for school lunches. The stovetop step made the flavors blend deeper, especially in chocolate versions. It also saved time, no need for a mixer or multiple bowls. You made it all in one pot. Some versions doubled as brownie recipes. Others used leftover coffee or fruit preserves for extra depth. But they all shared the same start: a pot on the stove and a wooden spoon. These cakes may have come from necessity, but they earned their place on every table they touched. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Have you ever thought to question why people use tin foil when they're baking? It's because it really helps keep the crust from overbaking, or in the worst-case scenario, even burning. Why does it do that, though? Well, the foil acts as a barrier to the heat, so it doesn't let all of it get through. This means that not only do you get even cooking thanks to the edges of your pie being closer to the heat source, you also get to ensure it cooks more slowly and at a more even rate. Pies also tend to have their crusts shrink on them, especially when they're filled with fruits and liquid fillings. The aluminum filling helps to make sure those edges stay in shape and don't pull away as the dough starts to cook and expand. It's not just a decorative choice. There are actually loads of reasons to start using tin foil to make sure you get the pie you should be eating. So, cold smoking your meat is a tried and tested method of making sure your meat lasts the long haul, no matter how rough it might get. These are techniques that have been proven to work by several cultures around the world throughout history, so you can definitely trust in their authenticity. What really is cold smoking, though? Basically, it involves exposing your meat to smoke that's from a temperature around 68 to 86 Fahrenheit, and that's a lot lower than the smoke that usually comes from warm fires. Cold smoking can't cook the meat, but what it does do is give the meat a pretty nice flavor and dry it out. We've already gone over why drying your meat out is such a good idea. but cold smoking was done via smoking chambers that were specifically built for this purpose. It was honestly a wonderful way of adding an incredible amount of flavor to your food. And thanks to coupling it with things like curing your meats with additional salts and drying them out, you get to have long-lasting, good-tasting meat for the majority of your next few months. Tell us which trick you remember most in the comments, like if you enjoyed the nostalgia, and subscribe to keep the forgotten wisdom alive.